China challenged a U.S. Navy ship, a serious mistake. At 0926 hours, Princeton's radar operators completed their classification. The contact was confirmed, a Chinese Type 052D destroyer accelerating fast on an intercept course. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical picture sharpened. The numbers didn't lie. At its current speed, the Chinese ship would close to weapons range in less than 15 minutes. The Americans had the advantage, and they knew it. The SPY-1 radar system gave them a picture so precise that every detail of the destroyer's superstructure stood out. Fire control solutions updated in real time, calculating angles, ranges, and probabilities. If it came to combat, Princeton's 122 vertical launch cells carried enough firepower to erase the threat before the Chinese captain even realized what hit him. But experience has a way of tempering nerves. The tactical action officer recommended raising the ship to general quarters, the standard response when a hostile moves this close. Yet the captain's answer carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his career sailing into tense waters. "We'll let them make the next mistake," he said. "No panic, no rush, just steady pressure." The bigger picture made that decision even more significant. The South China Sea was crowded that morning. Within a 50-mile radius, radar counted 46 merchant ships, oil tankers, container carriers, LNG vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars, all of them moving through international waters that the U.S. Navy has kept open for decades. If Beijing's goal was intimidation, the real risk was global. Any firefight here could send shockwaves through the arteries of world trade. Princeton's radar picture wasn't just being watched by her own crew. The data flowed instantly across the carrier strike group's network. The USS Nimitz, 2 escort destroyers, and every aircraft overhead saw the same thing. In seconds, a single blip on one radar scope became a shared target across the fleet. For the Chinese destroyer, the odds were shrinking fast. What looked like a lone American vessel on patrol was in fact the forward guard of a formation designed to crush threats from every direction. The U.S. Navy didn't need to shout, didn't need to posture. Its very presence told the story, and Beijing had just stepped onto the wrong stage. At 0930 hours, the entire U.S. formation shifted like clockwork. The Nimitz, 104,000 tons of steel and diplomacy, adjusted her flight operations without missing a beat. The carrier's deck crews moved with the same precision they had rehearsed thousands of times before. Catapults were readied, fuel lines secured, aircraft shuffled into launch positions. Nothing about the Chinese advance caught them off guard. Around her, the escorts moved into protective formation. The destroyers USS Chunghun and USS Kidd glided into station, weapons trained outward like bodyguards stepping in front of a VIP. Their sole mission was clear. If the Chinese fired so much as a single missile, they would never get the chance to reload. This was the essence of American carrier warfare. Every ship, every aircraft, every radar and missile battery tied into one seamless network. The data Princeton collected was instantly shared with the Nimitz strike group through cooperative engagement capability. That meant the Chinese weren't just facing one ship. They were facing a hive mind of war machines, each one updating the others in real time. Meanwhile, the sea around them was alive with commercial shipping. A Singaporean container vessel hauling semiconductors. A South Korean LNG tanker valued at nearly $200 million. Dozens of smaller freighters carrying everything from crude oil to consumer electronics. Every crew aboard those ships depended on the U.S. Navy's invisible shield. Beijing might posture, but the truth was unavoidable. American sailors had been protecting these lanes for over 70 years, and no challenger had successfully dislodged them. For the Chinese captain charging forward, that reality was setting in fast. He wasn't racing toward an isolated American destroyer. He was speeding straight into the defensive umbrella of the most battle-tested fleet on Earth. And the Americans weren't scrambling to react. They were calmly preparing to teach a lesson. At 0935, the skies above the South China Sea shifted. From over 200 miles away, an E-2D Hawkeye circling at 25,000 feet picked up multiple aircraft breaking from the Chinese carrier Shandong. The radar signatures were unmistakable. J-15 fighters, climbing fast and heading south toward the U.S. formation. On paper, it looked threatening. In reality, it was something else entirely. The American controllers noticed immediately. The J-15s were struggling for altitude. Launched off the Shandong's ski jump deck, they had burned precious fuel just clawing their way into the sky. Worse, they carried reduced payloads. No catapults meant no full combat loads. In effect, Beijing had sent underfueled, underarmed aircraft to challenge fighters that were about to launch at full weight. The response from the U.S. Navy was instant. On the flight deck of the Nimitz, steam poured from the catapults as Fa-18E Super Hornets thundered into the sky in perfect intervals. Every 45 seconds, another jet roared off the deck, banking hard to take position. What looked chaotic to an outsider was the very opposite. A ballet of timing and precision drilled into every American pilot and deck crew member. By the time the first wave of Hornets reached altitude, their AN/APG-79 AESA radars had already painted the incoming J-15 at maximum range. The technological mismatch was glaring. The Chinese jets relied on outdated, mechanically scanned radars that swept back and forth like lighthouses. The American systems, by contrast, tracked multiple targets simultaneously, feeding every byte of information into the strike group's network. Then came the invisible advantage. Each American fighter was linked through data link systems like Link 16. When one aircraft saw a threat, they all saw it. The Chinese pilots, on the other hand, depended on voice calls and individual radar returns. In a fight where seconds mattered, they were flying blind against a coordinated swarm. From above, the tactical picture was becoming clear. The U.S. fighters weren't rushing straight in. They were spreading into layers, high, medium, and low, creating overlapping engagement zones that left no path for the J-15S to slip through. The Americans were setting the trap, calmly and deliberately, and the Chinese pilots were flying straight into it. The American strike group didn't just meet the J-15 with speed and numbers. They unleashed an invisible weapon the Chinese couldn't match. Sliding into orbit at 20,000 feet came the EA-18G Growlers, electronic warfare specialists armed with ALQ-99 jamming pods. They didn't fire missiles. They didn't need to. Instead, they lit up the spectrum. Almost instantly, Chinese communications began to fracture. Radio calls were cut off mid-sentence. Radar screens on the J-15s filled with ghost images. What looked like 4 American jets suddenly split into 12, then 20. Contacts disappeared, reappeared, merged, and multiplied. The Chinese formations couldn't hold cohesion because they weren't sure what was real anymore. For the American pilots, it was like switching on a spotlight in a dark room. Their Link 16 network shared everything. Radar tracks, electronic emissions, missile locks, across the entire formation. Every Super Hornet saw what every other jet saw. It was coordinated warfare at the speed of light. The Chinese, by contrast, flew with systems better suited for the 1990s. Their data links couldn't support dispersed tactics, forcing them to stay bunched together in visual contact just to coordinate. To the Americans, this was a gift. Tight formations are predictable formations. Predictable formations are easy to kill. As the Growlers jammed, the Super Hornets spread into what U.S. pilots call the wall-high cover at 35,000 feet, mid-cover at 25,000, and low cover at 15,000. Any J-15 that tried to break through would find itself locked into someone's weapons envelope. It was overlapping dominance, perfected through decades of practice. Meanwhile, the Chinese pilots were expending fuel at an alarming rate. Launching from a ski jump deck had already cut their combat endurance. Now, forced into afterburner climbs and defensive maneuvers, they were burning through what little they had left. Every minute they stayed airborne tilted the advantage further toward the Americans. For Beijing, this was supposed to be a demonstration of strength. Instead, their fighters were locked in a battle where the outcome was becoming painfully obvious. And things beneath the waves were about to get even worse. While the skies were filling with electronic chaos, another layer of the fight was unfolding beneath the waves. At 0936, Princeton's sonar operators caught the sound they'd been listening for. A diesel-electric submarine, lurking 80 nautical miles to the southwest. The contact was noisy, almost embarrassingly so. The acoustic trace showed the familiar signature of a Chinese Type 039 submarine. Instead of moving silently, it churned through the water like a freight train, broadcasting its position to anyone with ears. For the American sonar team, it was less a threat and more a confirmation that Beijing was throwing everything it had into this confrontation. Still, submarines are never ignored. Princeton's AN/SQQ-89 sonar suite cataloged the contact, pinned its position, and tracked every movement with mechanical precision. Firing solutions updated continuously, ready to launch an anti-submarine rocket if the Chinese boat even twitched in their direction. To make matters worse for the Chinese captain, his batteries were running low. At 0951, he raised a snorkel to recharge, a move that made him even easier to detect. Above the waterline, the strike group already knew what was happening. Cooperative engagement meant every ship and every aircraft was fed the submarine's position in real time. The Americans had the contact boxed in, and quietly, there was another piece of the puzzle. A U.S. Virginia-class attack submarine had been shadowing the Chinese for more than a week. Completely undetected, it had positioned itself within striking distance of both the destroyer and the carrier Shandong. That's the kind of pressure Beijing couldn't see but could definitely feel. Their destroyer was under radar lock. Their aircraft were outnumbered and disoriented. And now their submarine, the pride of their undersea fleet, was not only compromised but effectively surrounded. Inside the Chinese chain of command, the gamble was unraveling. The plan had been intimidation, to box in the Americans with threats from the air, the surface, and below. But intimidation only works if your opponent believes you're capable of carrying it through. The Americans weren't just holding their ground, they were exposing every weakness in China's playbook. And when the Nimitz launched her full air wing, those weaknesses were about to be put on display for the world. By mid-afternoon, the Nimitz gave the order that ended any illusion of parity. At 14:30 hours, her deck crews launched everything that could fly. Within minutes, 48 aircraft thundered into the sky. Super Hornets armed with live ordnance, Growlers bristling with jamming pods, and Hawkeyes extending command and control across hundreds of miles. The air above the strike group turned into a wall of American power. The Growlers struck first. Their jammers flooded Chinese radar screens with false signals until they looked like abstract paintings. Real threats vanished into noise. Ghost squadrons multiplied across displays. Chinese controllers couldn't tell where the danger was coming from because the answer was everywhere at once. Then came the move Beijing never expected. A Virginia-class submarine, which had been silently tailing the Chinese task force for 8 days, surfaced within visual range of the Shandong. For 90 seconds, the black hull rose from the sea like a warning, water cascading down its sail. Lookouts on the Chinese deck saw it with their own eyes. Then just as quickly, it slipped back beneath the waves. The message was unmistakable. If this were war, their carrier would already be gone. The South China Sea had just witnessed a demonstration of absolute dominance. Above, below, and across the spectrum. And the Chinese knew it. By 16:20 hours, the Chinese formation began to break. The J-15s that had scrambled so confidently earlier were now limping back to the Shandong, fuel tanks nearly dry after a wasted climb and frantic maneuvers. Several returned on emergency reserves, their pilots forced to admit what they already knew. They had never been in control of the fight. The destroyer that had charged toward the Princeton slowed its engines, turning away under the thin excuse of maneuvering exercises, and the submarine that had risked detection disappeared into deeper waters, its captain surely aware that he had been tracked, boxed in, and outclassed from the very beginning. Official Chinese statements later claimed the encounter was nothing more than a routine drill, but every analyst watching knew the truth. Beijing had tried to stage a show of strength and instead revealed the limits of its power. Their air wing lacked endurance. Their destroyer was outranged before it could threaten a single American ship. Their submarine, supposedly stealthy, was exposed as noisy and vulnerable. For Washington, the outcome reinforced what sailors on the deck of the Nimitz already understood. The South China Sea was still American water in everything but name. For global shipping companies, it was reassurance that the arteries of trade remained protected. And for Beijing, it was a bitter reminder that challenging a U.S. carrier group is not a display of power. It is an invitation to humiliation. The showdown in the South China Sea ended without a single shot fired, but the message was unmistakable. China wanted to test American resolve. Instead, it watched its Navy, its Air Force, and its submarine fleet get exposed in real time. The balance of power wasn't shaken, it was reinforced. For over 70 years, the U.S. Navy has kept these waters open, not through bluster, but through overwhelming capability. And this encounter proved it once again. If you want more breakdowns of military power plays like this, hit subscribe. There's plenty more coming.